These Small Hours with Russell Cordell Staker. Hello, my friends. This is the Small Hours podcast. I am Russell Cordell Staker. It is the 17th of November, 2021, and this is the second segment and the beginning of the reading of my novella entitled In These Small Hours. Sit back and enjoy. In These Small Hours, a novella by Russell Cordell Staker. Through the unheeding many he did move, a splendor among shadows, a bright blot upon this gloomy scene, a spirit that strove for truth, and like the preacher, found it not. Shelley, Sonnet. Language, when it finally comes, has the vigor of a felon, pardoned after 21 years on hold, sudden, raw, stripped to its underwear. Toni Morrison, Love. If you can think and not make thoughts your aim, and lose and start again at the beginning, and never breathe a word about your loss, you'll be a man, my son. Rudyard Kipling, If. The river was cut by the world's great flood and runs over rocks from the basement of time. On some of the rocks are timeless raindrops. Under the rocks are the words, and some of the words are theirs. Norman MacLean, A River Runs Through It. For Rebecca, and for Dad, out amongst the stars. Prologue. I am nearing the end. I'm afraid, though, in my old age I have disimproved. The writing, which was never easy, now only comes by sheer perseverance. In the small hours I suffer its agony. Still, I persist. Near the end of her extraordinary life, my longtime editor asked me to tell her a story. I wasn't sure that I could. This unexpected request filled my heart with the same agony I have known as I write. I had no choice but to trust in the words. What emerged was ragged and imperfect, but it was true. I strung little dots of light into a constellation of language and of life down to its source. I was uncertain of the shape it formed and the luster it offered. I told her what was in my heart. When I finished, she made me promise I would write it down. What follows is the fulfillment of that promise. Part 1. I enter the study of my editor, Corinne Jacqueline Clifton, and find her resting in a neatly made-up hospice bed adjacent to an alcove of dormer windows where the light is particularly fine. I have read there on many memorable occasions. Corinne sits up and smiles. She is lovely. Her head is wrapped in a beautiful burgundy scarf, and in her lap is a book, but I sense she has been too tired to read much. Frailty eclipses her vitality. Hello, Ransom. I approach and lean down to kiss her softly on the cheek. I smell lavender perfume. She reaches up and touches my face with both of her hands. A light shines in her brown eyes. You managed to leave behind all that loathsome red rock and desert in Utah for a few days, I see, she says in her elegant voice, now nearly a whisper. I did. Who needs it anyway? I prefer the dank gloom of New York in the rain, I say. I'm glad you came. I told Rachel I may stay on for a while. She sends her love. You may have some merit as a writer, Ransom, but your wife is your greatest achievement, and don't ever forget that. I won't. Come, sit by me. Corinne gestures to a chair near the wall. I retrieve it and sit. She lowers the bed and then reaches over and rests her hands on mine. I feel the warmth of her fingers. I'm so terribly tired, she says. I miss reading. I miss the work. But these days, just getting through a page is an ordeal. It frustrates me. In my memory, I see Corinne sitting at this very spot on the floor, amongst her papers and the galleys of books she is refining for the writers she nurtures and with such clarity and care. Every so often, I'd find her in concentrated thought with a cigarette firmly clenched in her teeth, whilst writing incisive editorial commentary in the margins of a manuscript she always made infinitely better. The room delightfully redolent of freshly lit tobacco mingling with the lavender scent of her beautiful raven hair when I would kiss her cheek to greet her. What are you reading? A good book. I smile. Well, I thought I might read to you if you're up for it. I brought a few good books myself. And what did you bring? For starters, I thought we'd read Isaac Denison's Out of Africa, and then possibly light a candle in the window and let Boris Pasternak tell us of Dr. Zhivago and his passion for Lara. And finally, for good measure, I thought we'd partake of Time and Tide by the inimitable Edna O'Brien. Remarkable. Some of my favorites, Corinne says and smiles. Truth is, I have too many favorite books. It's the reason I had this awful deathbed of mine dragged up here in the first place. I thought I might finally have the time to reread a great many of them, only now I'm not so sure that being surrounded by all my books has been such a great idea. Why is that? I know soon I must leave them behind. They are my lifelong friends, and I don't want to say goodbye. Corinne's face changes into an unguarded expression I do not recognize. I watch her beautiful face wrench itself into a tightening knot of emotion. Ransom, she says. I'm frightened. I know you're frightened, I say. I've spent my life dancing with language. It makes me feel most alive, and when I feel alive, the threat of death doesn't frighten me as much. But this time, at the end, I am afraid, and no good book can change that. I know all these stories by heart, but what I really want to hear is one I haven't heard for the first time it's ever been told. Corinne centers her eyes on me. I would like to hear something that invites me to rise and walk a bit closer to that faint line I hesitate to cross. You move people with your words, Ransom. You have moved me more than most of a great many I have read. You see things most people choose not to. And I know that you see me just as I am now, and that you'll understand why I'm asking this of you. She smiles and asks, Will you tell me a story? I will, I say. I close my eyes and think of the silhouette of the man with the mop. Above Mom's writing desk was a framed oil painting of an abandoned boat and a disheveled man. It was the work of my father. He gave it to my mother shortly after they were married in 1972. Mom adored the painting. She often said Dad was the real artist in the family. He sees colors most people cannot. The painting calmed her as she worked. She said it helped her to find the words. I often found her staring at it during those long, quiet spells when the words weren't there. One night I asked her why she did that. Was there something in particular she saw? No, she replied, I'm just searching for all the things I can't see. I didn't say anything because I didn't understand. After Mom died, we moved to a smaller house. Dad let me keep Mom's desk in my room where I spent hours reading, and sometimes I would think about writing. The painting of the boat and the disheveled man ended up in the garage. 9 years passed. One cool evening, I went for a walk to think about a girl who wouldn't give me a chance. I came to a broad open field and lay in the grass to look up into the fading blue sky as the light of day began to blend with the black of night. Through wispy high clouds, I noted the stars and thought of a poem I once read that encouraged me not to think so hard. I was just 18, but I imagined myself as an ancient old man at the end of his long and curious life, and liked what I saw. For a brief instant, it felt as if I might drift from the ground up into the stars. The sensation scared me, but I lay very still for the space of a song on my Walkman. When the song ended, I got up and went home. I rounded the corner to the house, and there was Dad on the sidewalk in the dark, under the glow of the open garage, stooped over, peeling a foil butter paper from the curb which had fluttered from the torn trash bag in his other hand. "Goddamn butter papers," I heard him say. Dad turned and saw me. His red, frustrated face lightened, and he declared in his usual hearty tone, "Aha, there you are, my boy." I helped Dad with the rest of the trash. Yellow light poured from the garage. It shadowed the depth of the incline of the driveway in a manner that looked rather ominous and steep. We walked together from the curb and up into the sound of the Beach Boys' "Don't Worry, Baby," which was softly playing on the radio. Bill was situated behind a makeshift table Dad had fashioned out of an old bedroom door and 2 sawhorses. He was holding servo components for a new model airplane. In the span of my brief wandering absence out into the field behind our house, Dad and Bill had entirely unpacked a plane and were well into construction. "Which one is this?" I asked. "Ugly Stick," shouted Bill in full-throated excitement. He looked right at me, pushing his thick-framed glasses back onto the bridge of his nose, and smiled. "Oh yeah, baby," said Dad, his face alight and full of mischief. He was in his element. Hell, we all were. "Devil's Workshop is in high production mode now, my boys. This little bird is going to scream on fly day." We laughed. The garage, always a disastrous mess, was an ever-expanding amalgamation of things and projects and secrets, a proof of Dad's natural intensity for living. It was as if all things interesting and curious merged into one right there in that safe, well-lighted space on Cypress Lane in Salt Lake City, Utah. Bill and I basked in the brightly lit mischief of its wonderful confinement, where unfettered language enlivened the imagination of the moment. I think it was also the only place where Dad could put aside the weight of the worry he never really talked about, but sometimes I could see on his face. Building flying machines with his boys centered him, and together we built a great many. Several kits of airplanes in various stages of build were propped along the wall. 3 sets of wings, each beautifully covered in heat-shrink coverall fabric of bright monochrome color, maroon red, day-glow yellow, and royal blue respectively, rested on top of the old Oldsmobile. Bits of trash and plastic wrap and paper were scattered all about. Empty cans of Pepsi-Cola and Budweiser sat dormant like sentinels on a night watch. An open donut box with a stale, half-eaten gut rocket lay on another makeshift work table, along with a few pizza boxes. On top of a black tool cabinet was an empty Cheerios box I was awkwardly acquainted with. Months before, I pulled it down and discovered a hidden VHS tape wrapped in a black plastic bag. I got it out and read Ball Street. I went downstairs and put the tape into the VCR and then watched as the ugliest man I'd ever seen unzipped a voluptuous brunette's tight swimsuit at the edge of a swimming pool. He bent her over and mounted her with his turgid member like a dog. While he grunted with a wide-open mouth which revealed sharp, crooked teeth, she moaned and licked her red lips over and over again and rolled her eyeballs white into the back of her head. I was stunned. How in hell was this beautiful woman letting such an unsightly troll have his lascivious way with her? It made no sense. I returned the tape just as I found it, but for several nights thereafter I came back to it until one evening the tape wasn't in the Cheerios box anymore. I don't think Dad knew. After a while I stopped checking. It sort of made being in the garage with Dad awkward, but now not so much. I sat on an overturned bucket and watched Bill and Dad make adjustments to a shiny OS engine. As usual, my eyes drifted up to the oil painting which had once hung above Mom's writing desk, but which was now suspended above the only window in the garage next to a rack of skis and aluminum baseball bats. As I thought about it, the painting had always been around. It was meaningful because of its familiarity, and not particularly for what it portrayed, though to stare at it was to be arrested by it. It retained a minor mythology I hadn't previously cared to ask about. All I really knew was that Mom adored it. I knew its general story, but not the entire reason why Dad painted it. Something to do with a ghost he'd captured on film when he was a missionary in France. It was pretty to look at, and it always gave me a faraway kind of feeling, full of the sound of the sea. "Dad," I said. "Yeah." "The painting," I pointed. "Where was that?" Dad stood upright and looked. "Marseille, 1969. That messy see-through man by the boat, was he really a ghost?" Dad nodded slowly and then winked. A subtle smirk shaped his mouth. "You're not messing with me, are you?" "No, I'm not," Dad said in a matter-of-fact way, still smiling. "He was real, but I didn't know it until after. After you got the picture back, right? It was a slide, actually. It's what you did back then, sort of bourgeois cool. I didn't know he was there because, well, he wasn't, or at least in a manner I could see him, but the lens of my camera certainly did, and it showed up on the negative. Sort of scared the shit out of me when I first saw it. I even thought the crazy old Frenchman who developed my film had pulled one over on me, but I knew that was impossible." "Crazy," I said. "I think I remember seeing the slide. Do you still have it?" "I do. I've got my old carousels in the lockbox in the basement." "Damn it," said Dad. "Now you got me curious. I haven't seen that slide in a long time. Want to check it out?" He looked at Bill and me. He looked at Bill and then at me, and we nodded. Dad started toward the door. Bill and I followed. Dad put a small key in the gold padlock and lifted the heavy lid. Inside were several white containers of slides atop a carousel cartridge adjacent to the .357 Magnum and a .44 revolver, which, on occasion, Dad let Bill and I take up Big Cottonwood Canyon to shoot old appliances and other random things we saved for target practice. Dad pulled the carousel out of the box and inserted it into a projector he set on the floor with the lens pointed to the wall, and then lighted it up. The first image was of Dad in a long trench coat wearing sunglasses. He was smirking, looking away from the camera, but I could tell this was staged because he seemed to be directing whoever took the picture. He had one arm tucked inside the middle two buttons of his coat like the great General Napoleon Bonaparte. After a few clicks, the image I knew so well from the painting appeared. It was beautiful. Dad was as much an artist with a camera as he was with a brush. The photograph was perfectly framed. It captured soft orange light from the setting sun blending itself over the deep blue Mediterranean Sea. The old beached boat radiated and reflected light. My eyes were naturally drawn to the boat at first, just as Dad intended for the photograph he took, and there, just to the side of the boat, was the curious fellow Dad called his ghost. He stood some 10 feet from the stern and blended with the drawn diminishment of light on the horizon. Bill and I crept up to the wall to get a closer look. What differed markedly in the photograph from the painting was the man's tangible presence. Dad had painted him in an almost opaque and transparent way, but the light of the projector showed his corporeal form as hard flesh and bone in a grayer tone. I was also struck by his subdued but charming face. He seemed almost to be smiling, but not quite. His eyes really stood out. They had a familiar quality to them which was a little unsettling. I wasn't sure if they were green or blue or maybe even brown. He was simply standing too far away. He didn't at all look French. His disheveled manner of dress was precisely how Dad painted it. He wore what looked like a bedraggled canvas coverlet over a torn and stained white t-shirt, and his boots hung wide open with no laces, as if to catch at the ankles the bunched pools of fabric from the length of his khaki trousers. I got the sense he was just about to turn and face the sea, but he wanted to be sure of being photographed before he did so. I won't deny I was searching for some convenient conclusion, which informed a simplified impression as nothing more than my own willful curiosity. "You were completely alone when you took this picture?" I asked, still staring at the wall. "Yes. There wasn't a soul within 100 yards of me. I was standing on the sand next to a small covert in the retention wall near the docks and found that boat entirely abandoned. It had to have washed up with the tide months before and then just baked in the sun. I walked around it a couple of times to figure out the best angle for a photograph in the fading light. No one was around. I remember aside from the swell of the sea, it was very quiet. I don't even remember hearing the coo of pigeons, which was usually so persistent around the port of Marseille." "Do you remember physically taking the picture?" I asked. Dad hesitated a little. The playful nature he displayed just a few minutes before was subdued. He was being reflective, thoughtful. "Well, I have had a lot of time to think about the moment I took this picture, but I'm not sure I remember the precise instant we're looking at right now. Maybe that's because it remains a bit of my own mythology." Dad smiled a little. I was sensitive to the nature of Dad's ghost and his interpretation of it, even if I wasn't entirely sure I believed it was real. I knew in asking about it I was taking a small risk. Maybe he'd had a momentary lapse of memory, of reason. I wasn't going to judge. Additionally, I didn't want him to think that his artistic expression of the disheveled man had failed to depict and honor what seemed so obvious to me as I looked at the projected photograph on the wall in the dimmed and cozy basement, where for the moment the only sound reaching our ears was the soft whir of the projector fan and possibly the imagined flow of the sea. "Why is the image of the man different in your painting than what is here on the slide?" Dad sat back on the couch and put a hand to his lips. "I knew I was going to paint the picture as soon as I saw the slide, but I needed some time to think about it. The feeling I had when I first saw it was something of sadness. I also felt violated. None of these impressions were strong enough to register as dramatic, and I knew that no one would believe me if I told them. But I also knew what I knew. Some things in life come along and they are just as we find them, and we can either ignore them or take them in and let them expand our viewpoint. I chose the latter. I went back to the boat on many occasions and stood in the same spot where the disheveled man stood, and then I would go over to where I had been when I lined up the frame on the viewfinder just to see if there was some blind spot there that might have explained why I didn't see the man. Nothing came to me, and I don't think I expected that it would, but trust me, I weighed this undeserved moment over and over in my mind. It wasn't until I left Marseille for Geneva a good 6 months later, and soon after home to the States, that I made the decision to paint the man the way I did. My reason was my own, and mostly as a reminder to what I decided I would take from this odd little experience. I chose not to articulate his features because I had this distinct sense that he reminded me a little of myself much later in life. I looked at Bill. He was looking at Dad with a calm expression on his face. It felt good to be together in the basement touching on something none of us really understood. I guess, in the end, the slide and subsequent painting is the best part of that time in my life. It happened, and maybe it is still happening. In a way, that silly ghost is with me every day. I've never stopped wondering about him. Dad got quiet for a while. You know, I stopped praying after Mom died. I pray with you boys, of course, but that's enough for me. Somehow the air in the room of my own life was let out, and I spent a long time feeling pretty adrift inside. When I met your mom, she told me that she loved that I painted. I didn't go out of my way to show her some of my work. She snuck into my closet and found it and then brought it out into the light. She couldn't understand why I was hiding it. I told her simply that none of it was any good, and she laughed. I mean, she really laughed, to the point where I actually felt extremely uncomfortable. It was a moment of complete vulnerability. There I was in my bedroom apartment with a woman I wanted to make out with, and she was laughing at me. And then she stopped and put her arms around me, and she said, "Carl, you're the only man I know who sees the color I feel in my heart." It was your mom whom I first told my ghost story to. I'd never breathed a word of it to anyone. Much like the paintings in my closet in college, I kept it shut away from the light. Who would want to hear about it, I thought. Your mom did, and when I told her, she wanted to see the slide photograph, just like you boys do now. After I showed her the picture, Dad pointed at the wall. She told me that I should paint it. And so I painted it for her, but in truth, I was finally getting to paint it for myself. I painted everything but the disheveled man, and then I made the final choice on how I wanted him to be, just as he is on that canvas up there in the garage right now, just as he was for your mother above her writing desk. Dad became quiet again. We waited. Life is hard, boys. The hardest part of living is taking a look at what we usually don't want to see, but it's always in plain sight. I think that's what really counts. It's the stuff right in front of our face we choose not to see that we miss. I try to keep an eye out for all of it, and to leave a little space in every ordinary frame for the disheveled man, because I never know when he'll show up. "What if he does, Dad?" asked Bill. "Then I'll know he's there, and he'll know it too, and that is more than something." Late summer of that year faded into a crisp, bright fall with early snow. We finished Ugly Stick and set out for Fly Day, as Dad called it. Fly Day always felt like Christmas. When Bill and I were little boys, it certainly evoked euphoria in the home, and while our reaction as teens was a little more muted, it still charged our spirit with electric delight. Fly Day was more than just ending up west of the landfill in Salt Lake Valley, where Dad was a member of the Screamin' Ute Aviators RC Club. It was an event, and it started early. We never took just one plane. Usually it was two, and sometimes as many as three. Primarily, the planes we built and flew rarely came back home in one piece, if at all. A maiden voyage was usually terminal. We'd load everything up and head to McDonald's for a big pancake breakfast and a coffee of our very own. For Bill and I, it was one of the best parts of the entire day. The three of us would sit at the table like pre-flight aviators, fueling up as the men we were or imagined ourselves to be. The bitterness of the black coffee and lots of cream, followed by a forkful of pancake and sweet sticky syrup, running over eggs, and savory sausage made for a sublime repast, and one which fueled my dreams for weeks after. After that, we drove to Smith's Food and Drug to make short work of the only aisles that counted. The cooler in the car was already packed with sandwiches and water, but those things ended up buried under boxes of Twinkies and potato chips and Starburst chews. 6 packs of Country Time lemonade and Hawaiian Punch were insanely cold under fresh ice in a separate cooler, and at the very bottom, Dad always had a couple of cans of banquet beer. When we arrived at the field, a few of the old regulars were already putzing about. No planes were in the air. A hearty chorus rang out, "Hey, Carl!" And then, to a man, each and every one of those old dudes walked over to shake Dad's hand and take a look at his new plane. "Good to see you and the boys this fine October morning," said bright-eyed Jerry, who had a freshly lit cigarette in the corner of his mouth. It smelled good in the cool air. "You think you're going to land it this time?" "Boy, I sure hope so, Jerry," said Dad with a chuckle. But I knew Dad was nervous. He was a master model builder and a hell of a flyer, but in the years I'd stood by his side from my earliest boyhood memories to that particular morning, I had only ever seen Dad stick the wheels properly for a landing twice. And of those 2 moments, one didn't really count because he bounced the bird so hard it went straight up again about 20 feet and then flipped. Dad overcorrected. He lost orientation on the controls and pile drove the nose straight into the asphalt, cracking the engine in half. It made a terrible wallop in the nothing, just silence and the sound of air and grasshoppers. The fuselage of the plane ruptured balsa and bits of plastic everywhere. Crashes were inevitable and always oddly satisfying to watch, but at the moment of destruction it felt like pissing in our own pants. The warm thrill never lasted, and we still had to clean up the mess as well as calculate the work of reconstruction. In many cases, the planes just ended up in the trash can, which always felt like a colossal waste of time. The old regulars of the Screamin' Ute Aviators loved to razz Dad about it and always offered to help him master proper landing technique, which, on occasion, he allowed. I think Dad just wanted to figure out the feel for himself because he understood the design he'd built and wanted to come to it naturally. "I'm getting close to it," he'd say, before killing another perfect plane. It was time to fly. Dad wired up the engine block to the battery and then set the rubber spinner to the nose prop and gave it a jolt. The thud-rubbing sound of the spinner turned the propeller hard, transforming it into a translucent disc of air out in front of a full-throated Alto OS engine. Dad waved at Bill to unplug the wires on the engine block, and then he lifted the plane from behind at the wings and extended his arms out in front of his chest to get a feel for the weight and balance and lift of the airframe. Dad was something to see. Even as messy as he looked in that moment with his ball cap turned backwards and his pants hanging off his hips, he was truly a specimen. Tall and sinewy, with a bright shock of Redford-like strawberry blonde hair. It made me think of the way lonely married women at the grocery store looked at Dad when he walked by. He rarely noticed the pretty ladies. None of them were like Mom. None of them held his attention like she did. Sometimes they would make a pass at Dad. He was always charming and complimentary, but he had a faraway look in his eyes, and he moved past them without ever glancing back. Dad set the plane back on its wheels and signaled Bill to taxi. Bill rolled the plane forward with the radio and then brought it around to a full stop at the head of the strip and waited until Dad got over to him for the handoff. He took the radio from Bill and put the strap over his head and around his neck. As he always did, Dad paused before takeoff and looked at us and smiled. Then he gunned the plane, and off it went down the bumpy strip and quickly lifted up into the air. The brightness of the morning burned my eyes as the plane disappeared into the white glare of the sun. I squinted and looked at Dad as he looked up. Bill walked over and stood next to him. The Ugly Stick, with its sturdy airframe, flew exceptionally well. The plane was easy to track with its red-maroon body and black iron crosses and boxes of white over the middle part of the wings and tail. Dad took it up high into the air. I listened as the Doppler effect varied the pitch of the sound from the propeller. The plane made a lumbering barrel roll. I heard Bill say, "Wow." Dad leaned down and spoke into Bill's ear. He nodded. Dad brought the plane in low in front of us and then took it straight up into a twisting spiral and kept it going before leveling it out at about 200 feet. He looked over at Bill and nodded, then lifted the lanyard from around his neck and placed it over Bill's head. The radio was now all his. Bill's face was beet red, but after a few concentrated seconds, he began to laugh, first in little bursts, and then as the tension eased in fluid, songy giggles. He was having the time of his life. Dad put his arm around Bill and shouted, "Go, hot dog, go!" And boy did he ever. He flew that plane beautifully. It was time to bring Ugly Stick in. Bill lifted the lanyard and handed the radio control to Dad and stepped back next to me. I put my arm over Bill's shoulder and we watched Dad. I couldn't see any defining expression on his face, but we hoped he was feeling confident. I wondered, as I always did, if he had the stuff this time. All Bill and I could do was pray away the tension and watch. The specter of another inevitable crash did not diminish our willingness to keep trying. The point of consideration was now a calculation of damage to the plane. Would it be a total loss or something that could be repaired, and then how long in the garage before we could bring it back out into the light of another bright fly day? All of this fluttered in my mind as Dad lined up the approach and put the flaps down. The air was still, no hint of a crosswind. On the periphery, I could see the old guys lining up near the club shed, watching with coffee cups in hands, and Jerry with his requisite cigarette propped at the corner of his mouth. Dad augured in by setting his feet into the dirt at shoulder width and prepared for landing. He slowed Ugly Stick almost into a stall and then raised its nose high and let it glide softly downward until the rubber wheels touched the black asphalt of the airstrip, as if giving the ground a pert little kiss. The plane bounced a little and then jittered exuberantly as it rolled by us to the other end of the strip where it came to a complete stop. "Hot damn," Dad declared. Bill and I jumped. From behind came a wall of excited cheering and merry whooping. Jerry blurted, "God damn it, Carl did it." He flicked his cigarette into the dirt and started in our direction. We all ran to Dad. Light shone off the man who was my father, now a Greek god granted new glory. "Proud of you, Dad," said Bill, beaming. We gathered in a circle around the plane and laughed and talked, and dreamed new dreams for future flying machines. The glide path through the end of that year and into the one that followed was a smooth and happy ride. The days, filled with their requisite and dependable routines, were a comfort and collective joy. Dad's work was steady. Bill enjoyed the extension program for his special needs at East High School, and I waited tables and attended classes at Salt Lake Community College. Though no one openly defined in words the precise feeling in our little home, we excelled in its comforts. Always close, the bond between us was as strong as it would ever be. Possibilities abounded, and the future lay ahead like a swift and graceful sunrise. Soon I would be leaving home to chart new airways as a man under a broader sky. Over the years, when money was tight, which it often was, and there wasn't much to do, we would drive to an open field north of the runways at the Salt Lake City International Airport and watch the jets come home. Dad said it helped him to work out the math in his mind during times of stress. When I was younger, I didn't understand what he meant by that, but there was something about going to the field that felt familiar and right, and I figured eventually I would know why. I always liked the drive down from our house into the city and beyond to the airport and the view of the Great Salt Lake Basin surrounding it. Our particular spot was off a simple dirt road near Rudy Duck Club and west of Crossy Ranch. We'd get out of the car and lay on blankets on the hood and name the jets as they came in. These large flying machines with flaps fully extended were lined up for miles in the sky, sailing toward touchdown. One by one, they would pass over our heads at just under 1,000 feet in a primal roar. The ache of sound enveloped us whole like a giant ongoing wave we had our backs to as it immersed us in its exhilarating current, and there we bobbed happy in its massive wake, watching every jet on final through its descent just over and beyond the reclamation ditch, which bordered the neatly manicured field and its intricate, well-lighted tarmac. The reverse thrusters throbbed in the distance, sending back a wall of sound that eventually tapered off to a point where the whistle of the next oncoming jet approached and quickly replaced it. "Let's take a drive, boys, and go see the jets come home," said Dad about a week before I was on my way. "We'll get a pizza after." It was a beautiful evening in the early fall of that year, 1993. I remember thinking about the future as a word. Its very definition and the force of its sound on my lips was a sensory curiosity. The emotion inside of me was equal parts exhilaration and sadness. I sat in the back of the car, and Bill rode shotgun just like he liked to do. On the drive down 900 South into the city and beyond to the north end of the airport, I watched the profiles of my dad and brother in the bright light coming through the windshield. Dad was 44, Bill was 15. Dad inserted a Beach Boys CD and dialed up track 15. "Don't Worry Baby" came up on the display, and he and Bill started to sing along, but I didn't join in. Something clicked. Memory and its emotional range of perspective came fully into view. The past was now. The present as well as the future. The past was now, the present as well as the future. All three were one and the same, a recurring round of living memory. My eyes stung a little in the light. I knew things would never be the same again, and yet this life we were sharing together, right then and there, already felt like a story we had completely lived. I wondered if this was what it really meant to grow up. Dad reached back with his right arm and grabbed my shin like he'd done 1,000,000 times before and gave it a hard squeeze. I placed my hand over his and squeezed back. "I love this song," Bill shouted. "Me too, Billy boy," Dad sang along. "And if you knew how much I loved you, baby, nothing could go wrong with you." We parked and got out of the car. Just behind us, a Delta 757 with its high beams was coming out of a broad turn at an altitude of about 2,500 feet. It was beautiful. Its movement in the soft evening air offered itself as an impression of a boat on a clear lake. The wash of its sound was faintly audible and building as it came closer. A gentle breeze brushed my face, and I could hear the insects above the prairie grass. I looked in the opposite direction to where the jet was headed for landing, and noted the broad columns of the Wasatch Mountains to my left and the Ochre Mountains to the right. I raised my eyes up to the sky and wondered about heaven and this land and my place somewhere in the middle of the two. It was hard to know what any of this meant or why. I was simply a native son of where I stood, and that felt like enough. I breathed in a mixture of alfalfa and salt in the scented air and marveled at the unlimited visibility in every direction. How I wished I was at the controls of a gorgeous Boeing as it flew overhead with elegant authority. We stood together in a line and watched it land. "That never gets old," said Dad. For several minutes we didn't move. We watched and we listened, and we held the line we had formed together. I thought about Mom. She was always looking out for things she couldn't see. Did she see us? I couldn't see her, but I felt her there. "A 747-400, Northwest Airlines," Bill pointed. "Probably coming back from Europe," said Dad. "Man, that thing is sweet," I said. The size of the plane was stupendous. It dispelled all belief as it passed over our heads. In spite of the physics of design and my understanding of lift and velocity and weight in the medium of air, what I saw felt illusory and surreal. It was just too big to grasp, but it was there nonetheless. Sensational, I exhaled. The three of us high-fived and skittered about in the buzz of energy we felt. Bill nudged his Blue Dodgers ball cap back a bit and tightened his face into a thought. Rance, do you think those people are coming home or just stopping for a little while? The question hung for a beat. An answer on the surface was all too easy to give, and I knew better than to declare it. Bill was asking something that would remain with me. It was a sincere point of consideration with too many unknowns and every possibility. The collective lives aboard that 747 had been held in suspension together during the course of its flight, but soon that communal pause would end and thereby so release back into the stream of untethered life a diversity of singularity. I thought of concentric circles going out and away from a pebble dropped in water that just the moment before had been still. This force of motion never really ends. Some of those travelers were indeed finally home after being away. Others would pass through to somewhere else, and some were about to board for the first time for a lift up and out of the only life they had known, possibly never to return. As I thought about it, what we take on the first leg of any journey is just booster fuel and an experience for the ride out into an unexpected discovery of the colorful variety to come. Once downrange, our lives change, and then the final leg home is a dead reckoning with the makeshift craft we've transformed ourselves into. Its altitude and rate of velocity is something altogether different and hopefully more tempered and accurate than what we started out with. We navigate with more experience and care. Regardless of the journey, the eventual port of call is never what we thought it would be when we arrive, and what we find when we come back is altogether dissimilar than what it was. In the coming days, I would cross the Atlantic to a land I could only imagine, but even then it was impossible to know what I could only guess at. Greater still was how I would be different when I got back, and they too, Dad and Bill, would be different. I like to think they're all coming home, Bill. Me too, he said and smiled. Dad leaned over the roof of the Oldsmobile, arms extended, palms down. He was content, and so were we. Bill and I joined him by the car, where Bill sat on the trunk with his feet on the bumper, and I faced Dad from the opposite side of the roof. A steady flow of evening flights came in, and we called out every one as it flew over. After a while, Dad looked right at me and said in a quiet and clear voice, "Keep your eyes open, Ransom. There's a lot of bullshit in the mystery of the machine you're about to enter into. Just shrug it off and keep moving forward anyway. Some of it matters, but most of it, well, you'll do all right. Truth never needs a wrapper. Just keep an eye out for what others don't see. There's so many invisible people in this world hoping someone will see them just as they are. I know you. You have that sight, my son. Be there, strange angel." Dad stopped and looked down. "You don't have to do this, Rance, but I'm damn proud of you for doing it. I know you'll see it through. Never forget I was once there too, and I know what you're going to see. I know what you will feel. Come what may, Bill and I will be here, and when you get back, we'll be ready to build a new airplane together." "I love you, Dad. Love you, my boy." Dad stood tall and reached for Bill and touched him on the shoulder, and then walked around the car to me and did the same. "My boys." A few weeks later, I climbed aboard a Delta 767-400 and flew through the night over the Atlantic and into a land that remained with me as a memory as if from another lifetime. From there and after, everything sped up. 20 years passed. I moved through the hours suddenly cataloged into years, tasting the sweet, suffering the bitter, and finding that most of the dreams I once kept steadily fell away, one by one, into a harder, plainer reality. There was so much good in those years, and there, too, terrible pain. If my life were a song, this bridge of melody was languorous and subtle. I kept an ear out for the chorus, unsure I was hearing it. This music I seemed to float through was gentle. Much of it I won't bother to sing about, other than to say I eventually found myself drifting away from it. Like a man standing on the deck of a ship watching the lights of a good harbor fade away, I could hear the song I once knew by heart. Could hear those still singing along to it, sometimes laughing, sometimes crying in the volume of its freighted truth, just as I once had sung along to it myself. It was a good song, but it was never mine, and their voices were fading far from me now. I needed to write and sing one of my own. Thank you for being with me here in these small hours.